Well, thank you for showing up this morning at this early hour. It's a privilege for me to be here. I've certainly learned a lot over the last few days. And I hope that I can share some of my data on altitude training with you here today. My task is to talk about whether altitude training increases exercise performance in elite athletes or not. And there's a lot of literature out there going in both directions, I would say, so it's kind of impossible to summarize the literature. Instead, I will focus on stuff that we have done, because I can share the information with you there in detail, and then you can judge whether you think it works or whether it does not. Altitude training and the interest for altitude physiology in an athletic sense, I would say, started around the Olympics in Mexico City, where also Bengt, you can see here my former PhD advisor, he did some of his early work. From those Olympics, it became clear that if you, like this chap, reside in a high altitude environment, you're also likely to perform well in a high altitude environment, such as in Mexico City. So acclimatization to low, moderate, and high altitudes increases exercise performance in those environments. I'll just spend a bit of time on this before going into altitude training. Here you have the individual points of 7 or 8 individuals. These are their VO2 max values as measured at sea level. And these guys, they all went to the Olympics back then in Athens, so they're very fit individuals. We studied those at sea level, and then we studied them after 1 day of exposure to 2,300 meters, and as you can see, the performance is greatly decreased, which is no surprise, of course. We had the opportunity to study them after 1 week of residence to this altitude, where you will see that their VO2 maxes were increased by 3% as compared to day 1. The same was true for their time trial performance that we measured. After, here we go. After another week, exercise, or the VO2 max was increased by 7.5% compared to day 1, which of course means if you are to compete at high altitude, and if you come from Denmark like myself, you should not travel there the day before the competition, because you will be greatly limited in your ability to perform at this altitude. We studied them after 3 weeks also, and there some of the individuals had a small gain in VO2 max, some had a slight decrease. On average, the performance was improved by 8% compared to day 1, and just a bit more than 14 days, suggesting if you are to compete at high altitude, 14 days is probably the minimum you should arrive to the site of competition. And for some, 3 weeks may be better. Well, I think what most people do not realize, that for most normal people, I would say, 2,000 meters, is that really altitude? And yes or no. But for elite athletes, it is definitely high altitude. And for an elite athlete, 580 meters, which I wouldn't consider altitude, is actually harmful for their exercise performance. This is done by Chris Gore many, many years ago. But you can see in these slides that they have a reduced VO2 max and power outputs at 580 meters compared to sea level. So elite athletes are limited at these very, very, very low altitudes. And I'm pretty sure that most individuals who are to compete at 580 meters, if they come from Denmark, they do not consider acclimatization as part of their preparation. But in my opinion, they should. If you can't travel to altitude before competition, then what should you do? Are there other alternatives? You could consider to engage into one type of altitude training, the ethology term live low, train high, where you live here in Nottingham, for example, but you train under hypoxic conditions. Most of this work has been done excellently by Hans Hoppler. And it has been shown repeatedly by now that if you do this type of live low, train high, you will not increase your sea level exercise performance, but it seems likely that you will improve your exercise capacity in hypoxia. We did the first blinded study and a placebo-controlled study on this hypoxic training, and just as others have found, here we have a time trial performance, here we have the guys training in normoxia, here we have individuals that train in hypoxia. When they were tested in normoxia, we saw a similar increase in performance in both groups, which has been shown before. And as also shown before, we found a tendency for an increase in performance when the individuals were tested in hypoxia. So if you train in hypoxia, there was a tendency for your for your time trial performance to be increased when tested in hypoxia. For scientists, we would say, okay, there was no increase because it's the 009, but then if I was an athlete, I would say, I would still consider doing this. In prior studies, the improvement in exercise performance in a hypoxic environment, if you train in hypoxia, has been ascribed to peripheral adaptations within this skeletal muscle. But in our study, when we assessed mitochondrial volume density by electron microscopy, the improvement in peripheral adaptations was similar in the two groups. So I actually this, of course, does not correlate with the improvement in hypoxic exercise capacity. Usually Hans would see a greater increase of peripheral adaptations for those who train in hypoxia, but I think we did not see this because we had a lower degree of hypoxic exposure. So if you aim to perform at altitude, I would advise the individual to acclimatize for at least 2 or 3 weeks. Whether more is better, I don't know. If you do not have the chance to travel abroad for 2 to 3 weeks, then, well, you can live at home, but I would advise the individual to train in a hypoxic environment. So while it's clear that altitude acclimatization improves exercise capacity in that environment, the aim of altitude training in a classic sense is to improve exercise capacity at sea level. And the effect hereof are far less clear than those of altitude acclimatization. What is the rationale for altitude training to improve sea level performance? Well, one is that those adaptations that occur with altitude acclimatization, could be an increase in red cell mass, are linked to exercise performance, obviously. Another type of altitude training, where you train in the hypoxic environment, is that you may superimpose the peripheral adaptations within the skeletal muscle. This has, as I said before, has been shown now repeatedly not to induce any greater sea level performance effects than normal training. However, it has had a revival within the last few years if the individual conducts interval sprint training in hypoxia, and I'll come into this later in my talk. First, I will talk about the more what I would call classic altitude training, where you expect an increase in red cell mass and thereby an increase in exercise performance at sea level. Some years ago, we did a live high, train low study where individuals live at high altitude, but they train at sea level. We did this study to determine how exercise performance becomes improved after such intervention. Not why. And we did this because it was argued in the literature whether live high, train low facilitated exercise performance by means of central adaptations or whether it was related to peripheral adaptations within the skeletal muscle. We also wanted to do it double-blinded, which at this point in time had not been performed before, and we wanted to do it in good/elite athletes, and we were able to recruit such. We did our first study in France, and we did it in this building here, and this is not at altitude, but the top floor here, here you can flush the rooms with nitrogen, so you can induce hypoxia. And we did it here because we wanted to do it blinded, so the subjects were not aware of whether they actually stayed in a hypoxic room or in a normoxic room. We also did it here because the training facilities are really good. We had the live high, train low group. We had a placebo group. Initially, we aimed to do 3 weeks of altitude of intervention, but we ended up prolonging it with 4 weeks because we did not see what we expected to see after 3 weeks. Our initial plan was to have measurements 1 week, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks after the camp. So this was now reduced to 2 time points instead. The live high, train low group, they lived for 16 hours per day at 3,000 meters. Here you have the HB masses as determined by CO rebreathing. You can see this here. You can see these, they have about approximately 900 grams of hemoglobin, which is more than the average, but indicating that yes, these are elite endurance athletes. What you can also see is that there is no increase over time in the live high, train low group, and there's no difference at any time point to the placebo group. In the hypoxic group, we found some that had an increase in red cell mass over time that was greater than our typical error at the time for the measurement. So this could be seen as an increase. And in the literature, this would be referred to as responders to altitude training, whereas the other hypoxic guys that did not have this augmented red cell mass would be termed non-responders. But I don't think these are responders and non-responders. I simply think that this is biological variation over time. As measured by Prommer some years ago, they observed that hemoglobin mass, as most other factors within the body, go up and down over time, and that the average oscillation in humans is about 4.6% with a maximum oscillation of 6.9%. So we are well within the biological variations over time, and I think this is what we see here. Here you have the VO2 max data, and as you can see, the live high, train low group did not have an increase in VO2 max, and there was at no point a difference to the placebo group. We did a time trial performance on the subject's own bikes with a power meter in the rear, and as you can see here, there are no stars anywhere, so there was no differences between those who lived in hypoxia and those who lived in normoxia. If you pool the data, there is an increase in time trial performance over time, suggesting that a training camp as such is good, but you do not necessarily need to spend your time in hypoxia. To me, this was a surprise back then, and we looked for answers. Why was exercise performance, hemoglobin mass, not improved following our intervention here? One of the questions that we asked ourselves, well, how long time does it actually take hemoglobin mass to increase with altitude exposure? These are quotes from reviews in the literature by some of the famous and good guys. It's one of the slowest occurring acclimatatory processes, or true polycythemia may take several weeks to develop. And if you're an athlete, you want more concrete knowledge on how long this actually takes. So, in order to find out how long time does it actually take red cell mass to increase at altitude, we did a study in the Swiss Alps, and we chose an altitude that is much higher than athletes would use. We chose 3,400 meters of altitude exposure because we know that individuals who live in Leadville in Colorado at 3,100 meters permanently, they do have an elevated HB mass. So if you wouldn't see anything after 4 weeks here, then at least we would know, we could rule out that it was due to a too low altitude. The method that we used at the time is still a CO rebreathing method. We tilted the subjects back and forth in order to have a good mixture of CO in the circulation. As you can see here, the typical error now is 1.5%, which is pretty good for circulating volume within the body. What you can see is that we did not observe an increase in red cell mass before 21 or 20 days of exposure to high altitude. We measured these on every 4th day, And after these 20 days, we saw a 5% increase in red cell mass. Mind you, this is at a 3,450 meters altitude. This is really high altitude. In this study, there were no non-responders. As you can see here, after 20 days, as one individual has a dip below 0, but after 24 days, every individual had an increase in red cell mass. So I don't think there is, at this altitude at least, there are no non-responders versus responders in terms of HB mass. This is a horrible slide, and I apologize for this, but it's essentially the same as before. This is the last study day. This is the change in hemoglobin mass in the percentage, the last study day. This is after 7 days of return to sea level, and this is after 14 days. What you can see is that the increase in red cell mass that you have, it also vanishes quite rapidly. It's likely due to a phenomenon called neocytolysis, where the newest red blood cells are actively destroyed. So from an athletic point of view, if you want to have an advantage of this augmented HB mass here, you probably have to compete within the first 14 days upon return to sea level if you base it on HB mass assessments. So we know that within a month it is possible, if you go to 3,400 meters, to have an elevated HB mass in untrained subjects. We had the opportunity, and I say opportunity because this is an uncontrolled Wild West study where we had the opportunity to measure HB mass in 12 individuals that all went to the Sochi Olympics for cross-country skiing, so really, really fit individuals. 9 of them had a medal there, so good guys. We had the opportunity to measure HB mass before and after a 3-week training camp. We do not have a control group, and we did not take variations in training into account. But in those guys, we were almost able to see an increase in red cell mass, suggesting that if you live high, as these guys did, and trained high, and sometimes trained even higher, because they lived at 2,500 meters and then they went up to a glacier and trained, then yes, it was possible to increase red cell mass. Whether this translates into an improvement in performance, I don't know. Nonetheless, based on our 2 studies here, we decided to try one more time to do a live high, train low study, because we know that it is possible to increase red cell mass within a month. We had the funding to do the study, but it was hard for me to find really fit subjects until I met Bent Rønnestad, a happy chap from Norway. I met him at a conference in England a year ago, and he asked me, Carsten, why don't you do another study? I said, well, I cannot find fit subjects. And he said, no problem, come to Lillehammer, and it will all be fine. So after the ECSS Congress last year in Malmö, my friend and colleague Paul Robach and I, we sailed with a boat up here to Oslo and drove up to Lillehammer and did our final Live High, Train Low study there. And I'm very happy that we met Bent Rønnestad, because they have an awesome lab to do performance tests It's a depressive room as such. It's in a basement, but it's very well controlled, everything. It's air conditioned and so on and so on. So in their bunker, we did the VO2 max tests. We did 3,000 meter running indoor here, so at stable conditions. Oh, sorry, it was this button over here. We chose an altitude which I think is too low, but we did it on the current recommendation by Benjamin Levine and Robert Chapman that somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 meter, there's an optimal acclimatization response for sea level performance. So based on this, we took half the subjects to live in this hut here at 2,160 meters. And you can see there's a cable car here which could rapidly take them down to Chamonix, where the other half of the subjects lived. The altitude group lived up here for a month, trained at sea level. We know exactly how much time they spent up here because they took the lift up and down, and you can simply have the readout from the lift system. So they had a bit more than 18 hours per day they spent in this hut. We took great care to control for every little detail. So when the individuals had salmon up here for dinner, the guys down at sea level had salmon. It was the same food. All individuals trained together at all times. We supervised every training session. As you can see here, we had 3 or 4 minivans where we drove the subjects around. During this month, we drove 30,000 kilometers to accustom them or to have them happy and have them train what they wanted. They trained together, which is a great advantage of this study. So here's the training camp. We did the measurements, remember, in Lillehammer, in Norway. We did the post measurements in Lillehammer, in the same room, in the same standardized conditions. Many altitude training studies, they do it on location with differences, maybe a bit difference in altitude, and so on and so on. I would say this is really controlled. And as you can see, 3 days after the camp, HB mass is a bit higher than it was before, but it's equally improved in both groups. As you can see, there's no treatment statistical outcome. It may be difficult to see that there's a slight increase here, but if you express it in percentage, you can see that this is approximately a 3% increase in red cell mass. If you don't have a control group, you would think that this is due to the altitude. Here you have the VO2 maxes. Some of the subjects were females, that's why it isn't really, really high. But as you can see, compared to before, there's a slight increase in VO2 max over time, but there's no difference between the two groups. In terms of 3,000 meter running performance, so remember, HB mass went up, VO2 max went up, running times become less, so they run faster. It was equally improved in both groups, suggesting that this type of altitude training, 1 month, 18 hours per day at 2,160 meters is not any more efficient for performance than normal sea level training. So based on this initial study, I would not recommend live high, train low to elite endurance athletes since, well, live high, train low does not convincingly increase performance in all elite athletes. On the other side, if a given athlete feels that it works, then by all means, do it. In science, placebo is a horrible thing. In athletics, it's wonderful. Just have 2 or 3 more minutes, and then I'm done. As I said before, the live high, train low had kind of received a renaissance in terms of repeated sprints in hypoxia. What you can see here are individuals who are performing repeated sprints. Either they did this in hypoxia or in Normoxia, so 4 weeks of this type of training. And then following this type of training, one group has shown an increase in the number of sprints that you can perform. So instead of doing 9 sprints, the white bar before this type of training, they now do 13. We thought this sounded like a lot, and we did a similar sprint training in hypoxia. We had 15 trained young subjects. We did it with the subjects blinded, the investigator blinded. It was a crossover design, so I think a good design. Here's what we found in terms of sprint ability after this sprint training in hypoxia, on 2 conditions after the intervention period. So we have post 1, which is 3 to 4 days after the last session. And we have post 2, which is 14 days after the last sprint training session. As you can see, the p-value between those who trained in hypoxia and those who trained in normoxia suggests that there's absolutely nothing to it. We also did these repeated sprint bouts after a VO2 max test to kind of resemble outdoor performance, maybe to have a sprint towards the finish line in the bike race. And again, of course, they do a lot less sprints now because they are fatigued due to the VO2 max test, but again, there's absolutely no effect of the hypoxic sprint training in comparison to normoxic sprint training. We also did the repeated sprints after a time trial test of about 25 minutes, and you can see here they do a lot less sprints because, of course, they're super fatigued by this time trial. And again, there's absolutely no effect of this repeated sprint training in hypoxia. These tests were all done in normoxia. We also did them in hypoxia at the same altitude as where they trained and saw nothing. So to conclude on our repeated sprint study in hypoxia, we did 12 test sessions following the intervention period. Other studies do 1, and ours were all negative. So we will not recommend repeated sprint training to athletes. So to address the question, does altitude training increase exercise performance in elite athletes? I would say based on our studies, no. But go for it if a certain athlete thinks it may work. Thank you.